Africa is increasingly coming under Russian influence. Alongside the Chinese, it is Vladimir Putin in particular who wants to fill the power vacuum in Africa. For example, the Central African Republic, a country almost twice the size of Germany, is almost entirely under Russian control. A large proportion of the local population worships the Russians as liberators and supports their attack on Ukraine. And in other unstable regions of Africa, too, more and more states are turning away from the West and celebrating Russia as the new protecting power. But how has Russia been able to gain so much influence in Africa? What strategy is it pursuing, and what are the prospects for the future? We will look at all these questions in today's video. Russia has only been interested in Africa again for a good 10 years and has made clever use of its contacts with former partner states from the Soviet era, such as South Africa and Angola. Trade agreements were concluded, but in contrast to the West, Russia did not ask any questions about human rights or the political system. The African states were primarily interested in weapons, with the result that almost half of arms exports to Africa now come from Russia. In return, Russian companies were often given easier access to raw materials, or entire swathes of land were sold directly to Russian companies, which naturally led to a steady increase in Russia's influence. One country where the Russian strategy is particularly evident is the Central African Republic. The country gained its independence from France in the year 1960, but in the period that followed there were repeated coups, military revolts and upheavals, making the country one of the poorest countries in the world today, despite its natural resources. In the year 2013, another brutal civil war broke out in the country. Even the French soldiers stationed there were unable to achieve lasting peace, which is why the newly elected president in the year 2016 turned to Russia. This came in very handy for Russia to further expand its influence, and from the year 2018 it supplied the African state with weapons and sent military advisors to the country. The Wagner Group is a particularly important instrument here. A private Russian security company that often takes care of Russia's dirty business abroad with its mercenaries. More than 1,000 mercenaries are said to be stationed in the Central African Republic, where they ensure law and order. Russia is thus keeping the country's ruler in power, training the military and driving the rebels into remote parts of the country. However, a UN expert group reports mass executions, torture and forced displacement of the civilian population. In return, the Russians have a virtually free hand in the state, and Russian companies have a monopoly on the extraction of the country's raw materials, which is secured by the Wagner Group. However, the Central African Republic is just one of many states in which Russia is gaining increasing influence. The mercenaries of the Wagner Group, also known as the Shadow Army, are now said to be active in 23 African countries. But they are also active outside Africa, for example in Syria and Ukraine. And that brings us to the strategy that Putin is linking to this. Through the influence that Russia gains through its operations in African countries, it creates allies, and through targeted propaganda, the population in many countries sees Russia as a liberator. For example, the following Russian advertising clip shows children the alliance between the African lion and the Russian bear. It is also a propaganda war in the social media in which Russia is increasingly gaining the upper hand. The increasingly isolated Putin is thus gaining votes and allies at the United Nations and is able to push Western states such as France out of Africa more and more. They seem increasingly overwhelmed by the situation in Africa, which is why more and more troops are being withdrawn or expelled from the country by the rulers there. Mali is a good example of this. The French were called in to help against the jihadist insurgency in the year 2013, and Germany also took part in the operation. However, the government was overthrown and the demonstrators waved Russian flags and portraits of Putin, who was supposed to finally bring peace to the country. The Wagner Group was then sent to the country to support the new military government and ensure law and order in the country. France then withdrew from Mali, and there are also discussions about withdrawing the remaining German soldiers. A similar picture is also emerging in other African countries, which is why Russia is gaining more and more influence there. However, it must also be said that Russia is currently extremely weakened by the many setbacks in Ukraine, which is why it is uncertain to what extent it can maintain its commitment in Africa. Nevertheless, this did not stop the Russians from detaching another country from the European sphere of influence a few weeks ago, Burkina Faso. However, France now seems to have recognized the seriousness of the situation and is increasingly turning its attention back to West Africa, with Macron countering Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's trip to Africa with a trip of his own, and France is now actively trying to counter Russian propaganda in Africa. There is therefore a great deal of competition in Africa at the moment, and it remains to be seen which direction Africa will take. Especially under the influence of China, which we haven't even mentioned here yet. And because other countries such as Turkey and India also want to expand their influence in the region. But that would definitely be material for a video of its own.